Americans experienced much more violence in 2020 compared to previous years. Gun violence and gun crime increased significantly, with over 19,000 people killed in shootings and firearm-related incidents in 2020. This number of deaths is the highest in more than 20 years. Mass shootings, which are classified as an incident in which 4 or more people are shot and injured or killed, has risen sharply to over 600, the most in the past 5 years, and nearly 50% increase in 2019's total. Much of the violence involves guns is related to gangs, gang warfare and retaliation.
According to the FBI, some 33,000 violent street gangs, motorcycle gangs, and prison gangs are criminally active in the U.S. today. U.S. law enforcement categorizes these gangs as sophisticated and well organized. They say that they all use violence to control neighborhoods and boost their illegal money-making activities, which include robberies, drug and gun trafficking, prostitution and human trafficking, and fraud. Our first guest, Ramiro Fuentes, an activist and political commentator, is joining us.
One phenomenon of the United States that is interesting to the rest of the world, that a lot of people of other nations outside of the United States frequently wonder about, is the prominence and rise of gangs, mainly street gangs, in cities like Los Angeles, where I'm speaking to you from now, New York, Chicago. The city where I'm speaking to you now, Los Angeles, for many years was considered the gang capital of the world. A lot of the major street gangs that were formed were created here, a few miles away from where I'm speaking to you now. Some of these gangs are well known, the Bloods, the Crips, and interestingly enough, a lot of gangs that were formed in Los Angeles, including MS-13 as well, were rooted in imperialism and capitalism, were the result of U.S. colonization, poverty, racism. And in Chicago and New York as well, a lot of the gangs that sprang up in the 1950s and 60s started off as community groups. For example, in Los Angeles, one of the oldest gangs that was formed that still exists today is known as the Crip gang, which uses the color blue, the Crips. Interestingly enough, the word Crip, C-R-I-P, stands for Community Revolution and Progress. And the Crips was actually an offshoot of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense that promoted Black nationalism, independence from U.S. empire, socialism, anti-imperialism, that was friendly with Islamic anti-imperialist countries as well. And during the 1970s and 80s, during COINTELPRO, as the FBI began infiltrating the Panthers, began promoting drug use among revolutionary movements and fomenting drug wars, the Crips became an official offshoot. They became a street gang, and they were involved in some really bad criminal activity, as well as the Blood gang as well. Also here in Los Angeles, another gang that started here was MS-13. We heard during Trump's presidency him refer to MS-13 very frequently. And interestingly enough, MS-13 did not start in Central America. MS-13 started in Los Angeles, California, due to Salvadoran migrants who were fleeing a U.S.-backed imperialist war created by the drug wars, created by the paramilitary violence. Salvadorans who fled to Los Angeles and created a group called MS-13 as a community defense against Mexican gangs who had been prevalent in Los Angeles. And eventually, MS-13 as well, due to that influx of drugs, of infiltration by U.S. feds, also degenerated into street gangs. In Chicago, you have the Latin King gang that uses gold and black. The Latin Kings were a community organization of defense of Puerto Ricans in Chicago against Italians and Irish racist gangs where they were being attacked as well. And the Latin Kings were also evolved in the same era as the Young Lords movement, which is a Puerto Rican liberation independence movement against U.S. imperialism. And unfortunately, that was also infiltrated and subverted for gang activity. So if we look at all of the major gangs in U.S. history, the Crips, the Bloods, MS-13, the Latin Kings, so many others, they started off with an interesting purpose, a purpose of defense for a certain oppressed nationality or people because of racism, imperialism, colonialism, but they were later subverted when they became too powerful, when they were too organized in the streets. They were subverted by the FBI as part of COINTELPRO so as to not get political and to focus on drugs, focus on crime, focus on attacking the community. And this is an interesting history of US imperialism. And it just exemplifies the way in which the US empire is able to co-opt, subvert, and weaken movements that begin with a revolutionary potential, but later just disintegrate into crime.
One of the main reasons young people join gangs is poverty and unemployment. This is seen mostly in the African American community, Hispanic and Native American communities, as well as other minorities in the United States, especially in urban areas and large cities. Lack of a good education and job opportunities puts these communities at a disadvantage, and this motivates a number of youth to drop out of school at a young age and join street gangs that provide them with an income, albeit through criminal activity.
We also know that unemployment is very high among Native American communities, Latino communities, African American communities, and gangs step in and fill in where small businesses and the government does not fill in. In a lot of poor working class neighborhoods in the United States, there is no government plan to create jobs. There is no plan to give people a trade, to give people the skills they need to sustain themselves. And a lot of these gangs influence youth who are looking for money, who are looking for a way out of poverty. And they come in with these offers of performing criminal activity in exchange for money. So again, their influence is largely based on the failures of the so-called free market, the failures of the US government to be able to provide people with the ability for them to fend for themselves, to have skills, to have good jobs and a good living.